What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for High on Life, a sort of comedy shooter from the creators of Rick and Morty, with what I imagine is a relatively polarizing sense of humor. But before we dive into that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're not subscribed and go to my channel page, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything that I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. And as a quick aside here, a couple of the achievements for this one were initially bugged, but were fixed after an update that happened relatively quickly that also fixed a few other issues, but that was mostly for collection stuff, which doesn't really matter for the review anyway. But let's actually dive into this thing. So, as I mentioned, High on Life is a comedy shooter. It is a game that makes fun of a lot of other games. It pokes fun at various video game tropes, just kind of silly things that we all kind of have grown accustomed to as we play video games. It takes aim at a lot of that stuff, and it does so largely in the style of Rick and Morty, which isn't surprising as one of the creators is involved with the game. But that's probably the most important thing I want to lead this review off with, is that the comedy in this game is polarizing, and it's most of the game. If you don't like the comedy, you're not going to like the game. If you don't like Rick and Morty, for instance, you probably won't like this. It's got a very crass, raunchy sense of humor, and if that's not your cup of tea, then this game probably isn't for you. And while the game is $60 on Steam, it's also on Game Pass, which makes trying it out a much more acceptable proposition for most people. And we'll talk a little more about that later, but for a couple different reasons, I really do think that Game Pass is the way to go when it comes to playing this game. And while I grabbed it on Steam, it's something to keep in mind. But from there, let's talk difficulty. The game has 3, story, normal, and hard, but honestly, these all felt basically the same to me. Technically, you take a little more damage on each one, but honestly, the combat is so easy, especially once you get used to it, that it really just was a non-factor. I really couldn't tell much of a difference outside of the damage my character was taking in most cases, but it's not a particularly difficult game, though story mode is there if you need it. But that brings us to the story setup. Now, the story for this particular game is somewhat simple, and the plot setup is honestly most of the game, so if you don't want spoilers, maybe skip past this part, but just knowing what the game is about from the marketing would tell you most everything there is to know about the story, which is Earth being invaded by aliens who have come to use us as drugs. In this particular universe, a space drug cartel known as the G3 takes over various planets with different species to then use them as drugs, humans being the latest and greatest version of this. You manage to escape this fate by finding a Gatlin, which is a talking sentient race of guns, who leads you off the planet to a space city known as Blim, where you come into contact with another alien who sets you up with a bounty hunter suit, which is what allows you to take bounties out on the G3 cartel, tracking down their leaders and dismantling them, all while, of course, going on wacky space adventures. All in all, though, the story's probably going to run you in the ballpark of about 10 to 12 hours. It also has a decent amount of non-linear elements as well as some missable stuff. The story itself is presented as you tracking down various G3 cartel members through your bounties. However, this is done in phases. Each phase of the story, you'll be able to track down a couple different ones, and you can choose which one you go after first. And this, as well as a couple of other decisions, will occasionally present you with missable options. However, these don't really affect the overall narrative. And while the game itself does occasionally make fun of games having choice and consequence and replay value, the game ironically does actually have a decent amount of replay value because of the way it approaches this. But in addition to this, we also have various worlds to explore. The worlds themselves will open up as we progress and access more abilities that allow us to traverse different types of terrain as we go after these G3 cartel members. And the exploration is decent. For the most part, what you're doing when you're looking around exploring is looking for the various chests that you can find, which are called lugloxes, and these will have various currencies, upgrades for your weapons, things like that. Now, let's talk progression systems. There's really only the 2. Upgrades to your suit, as well as your weapons, and the weapons themselves. So let's talk about the weapons. The Gatlins. There are several. Each sort of cartel boss will actually have a weapon for you generally, or something leading up to them will have a weapon that you'll then pick up. Each weapon has a special ability, which usually allows you to traverse more of the terrain in these worlds. They all also have their own distinct personalities and styles to them, and they will talk to you somewhat frequently, although you can determine the exact frequency yourself in the options menu. And throughout the world, as well as in a couple of shops throughout the game, we can find upgrades to these weapons, which will increase the ammo, damage, weapon types. There's a few alternate mods you can add to each weapon as well to change how they function to actually upgrade your weapons with. And then you also get upgrades for your suit, which will do stuff like give you better shields, better health, the ability to dodge, slide around, all the usual suspects. And with the game being relatively short, it does feel like you're getting these upgrades very regularly. But even if you don't grab them all for the story, after the story's over, you can run through, grab everything you missed, even find a couple of secrets, including uncovering a secret plot that the game refers to via the achievement for finding it as sequel bait, which made me laugh. But the progression is decent enough for what the game is, and there's a lot of stuff to do as well. From there, let's talk combat a little bit. It's better than I anticipated it being, to be honest, but it's not amazing either. As you've probably seen in the gameplay up to this point, it plays somewhat like Doom, but easier and lacking enemy variety. And the lack of enemy variety is probably my biggest complaint. You spend most of the game fighting like maybe 3 or 4 enemy types, with the boss fights, of which there are a few, being the most notable events. The boss fights were actually pretty decent, and it is fun switching between weapons that all have various powers and abilities, but again, at the end of the day, there's only so much they can do with the combat system that is present, and while it is better than I thought it was going to be, it's not enough to hold the game up on its own because, again, the game is primarily comedy and humor elements, and even the combat leans into that. So the combat is good for what it is, but it's still kind of basic. And then from there, let's talk Steam Deck compatibility a little bit. So the game runs pretty well on Steam Deck. You will of course have to change most of the settings to low, which is relatively standard for Steam Deck, but it also has controller support, so the Steam Deck controls feel pretty natural, mostly what you'd expect from a shooter on console. But there are 2 things working against you there. For starters, this particular game does not have cloud saves set up, meaning that if you're playing on the Steam Deck, you'll have to play that save exclusively on the Steam Deck, as opposed to being able to transfer it back and forth between that and PC. And as I mentioned earlier towards the beginning of the video, the Steam version is $60, and with the game being relatively short and not having the cloud saves, I feel like most people aren't going to be playing this too terribly much on the Steam Deck. But if you want to, it's a decent experience. There are a few frame drops in some of the more open areas, but for the most part it was okay. Now, before we jump into wrapping this video up, I do want to mention a few technical issues. There is no field of view slider as it stands. There is a way to change it if you know what you're doing and you're comfortable messing with files, but while I imagine this will get patched in pretty quickly, at the time of this review there's nothing for that, which will lead to some people dealing with motion sickness. In addition to that, while I personally didn't really experience anything game-breaking, I have seen multiple reports of some pretty serious game-breaking bugs in regards to progression or things not working properly, but all I personally experienced was the bugs with the achievements, which really doesn't matter, as it was fixed very quickly and doesn't really affect the gameplay at all. But that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will draw this to a close. So on the positive side of things, I thought this game was hilarious. I enjoy this style of humor. I enjoyed the South Park games, for instance. I just find stuff like this funny. I appreciate it having a laugh at all of the video game tropes that I, as someone who plays and reviews games constantly, see and deal with every day, and someone pointing out the absurdity of some of that is a good laugh for me. But I admit that's polarizing. Some people aren't going to like this humor, which is the way it goes. But another big positive is that the game is very focused. It's not really shooting for the moon. It knows what it wants to do. It's decently paced. There's some fun stuff thrown in there on the side, which keeps it from feeling overwhelming. It's easy to jump in, to have a few laughs and move on. But that brings us to our negatives. And for me, the negatives were mostly that there's just not a lot here. This is a relatively short game, and even with some of the time-consuming side stuff, you're looking at probably 20-25 hours to do everything, potentially less if you're really rushing through it. Then there's the issue with the lack of an FOV slider, which is going to make some people sick, the game-breaking bugs that have been happening, and as I mentioned, combat that is okay, but isn't really incredibly engaging and gets repetitive pretty quickly. All of which brings me to my conclusion, which is that High on Life is inherently a little polarizing. The comedy is everything. If you don't enjoy the comedy, you're not going to enjoy this game, because the rest of the game, the mechanics, the combat, things like that, are not enough to stand on their own. Without the humor, this is a very average shooter. But if you like the humor, this is an incredible experience that will have you rolling. I personally enjoyed the humor, so I got quite a few laughs out of this game, and it was a pretty enjoyable experience. And as a result of that, I would not mind seeing more of this type of game in the future, or even a sequel to this one. But when it comes to recommending this title, that's a little trickier to answer, because while I personally enjoyed the game very much, as I've mentioned multiple times, it's definitely not for everyone. So what I would actually recommend you do is try this on Game Pass, because on Steam, this game is $60, which is a pretty decent gamble on whether or not you find this game funny, whereas Game Pass removes a lot of that risk and allows you to play it for a little while, see if it's for you, and then if you enjoy it, continue. Personally, I thought it was great. I paid $60 for it myself, and I think the laughs were worth it. But for most people, I think it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you have Game Pass. That is going to do it for me. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what you feel about the game. Did you like it? Did you find it funny? Was it hit or miss for you? I'm curious to see people's reactions to this one. But regardless of all of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.